Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Today, we're exploring a book that became one of the most powerful intellectual warnings of the 20th century, a book that argued with haunting clarity that good intentions are no defense against tyranny. That book is The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, first published in 1944. Why do we know the name Friedrich Hayek in the first place? Many of us are vaguely familiar with his work, and the reason why he's stuck around in the intellectual culture is because his ideas cast a long shadow in economic and political thought. Hayek himself was a refugee from fascist Austria, a man who had witnessed firsthand how a seemingly civilized society could descend into totalitarianism, and he feared that the same descent might occur in Britain and America, not through Nazism or communism, but through something more familiar: the expansion of government control in the name of progress. The Road to Serfdom is one of his most impactful works, so let's begin with the central premise of the book. Hayek asserted that the concentration of economic power is the concentration of political power, and that when a government assumes the responsibility to plan the economy for the common good, it inevitably must suppress dissent, limit choice, and ultimately rule through coercion. Hayek was not writing in a vacuum. Europe in the 1930s and 40s had become a battleground of ideologies. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany and communism in Russia was not, as many thought, a return to barbarism, but a logical consequence, Hayek argued, of replacing individual liberty with collective planning. Hayek's thesis stands on an important historical observation: that no totalitarian regime, from Hitler's Germany to Stalin's Russia, began with overt brutality. They began, instead, with high-minded goals of economic justice, national rejuvenation, or social harmony, goals that quickly required government to assume control over increasingly large swaths of life. Once that control was granted or seized, dissent became sabotage, criticism became a kind of treason, and choice became subversion. Hayek was acutely aware that Britain, in its fight against fascism, was veering toward centralized planning under the banner of wartime necessity and post-war reconstruction. But he feared that even temporary planning, even in times of emergency, set a precedent that would be difficult to reverse. Sound familiar? The longer the state directed production, fixed prices, redistributed resources, the more likely those controls would become normalized, rationalized not as emergency measures, but as moral imperatives. And, in turn, he writes, quote, "The more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual," end quote. And this gets to a critical insight. Liberty does not mean the absence of physical coercion. It means the ability to plan one's own life, to choose one's own goals, to pursue one's own vocation, to invest, to fail, to speak one's mind without fearing the consequences of challenging some new orthodoxy. This is what Hayek calls a liberal order. Not liberal in the partisan American sense, but in the classical sense, liberalism as the political tradition that champions individual rights, limited government, and the rule of law. Hayek reminds us that a true liberal society doesn't aim to make everyone equal in outcome, but equal under the law. And to preserve that equality under the law must be predictable. It must be general. It must apply to all, not just to some. It must bind the government as much as it binds the governed. In this respect, Hayek draws a critical distinction between law and legislation. Law, in his classical sense, is not an instrument of social engineering. It is a set of principles that set boundaries within which individuals may freely act. Legislation, by contrast, can become a tool of arbitrary will, constantly shifting to suit the planner's latest schemes. The result is unpredictability, and unpredictability is fatal to freedom. Let's take a concrete example. Suppose a government sets up a board to determine the fair wages of different professions. Its goal perhaps is noble, to reduce income inequality or ensure that every job is treated with dignity. But what begins as a gesture of economic fairness quickly devolves into a political struggle over who deserves what. The board becomes a magnet for lobbying, favoritism, and ideological capture, and soon, wages are no longer a reflection of supply and demand, risk and reward, but of political power. This is what Hayek means when he warns that economic control becomes political control. And once political control invades the economy can no longer provide a neutral ground upon which individuals cooperate freely. Every transaction, every job, every enterprise becomes bound up in politics, and that's when freedom starts to vanish, not in one dramatic purge, but in 1,000 subtle permissions and prohibitions. Now, Hayek is not blind to the appeal of planning. Planning feels efficient. It feels fair. In a chaotic world, the idea that experts can coordinate resources to maximize output, guarantee employment, this sounds rational. But Hayek insists that the central problem of economics is not efficiency, it's knowledge. No planner, no matter how brilliant, can ever possess the decentralized knowledge dispersed across millions of minds acting in their own local contexts. The market, for all its messiness, is the only mechanism capable of synthesizing that knowledge into coherent patterns. When you allow prices to fluctuate, you're not just allowing people to make a profit, you're enabling the transmission of information. A price rise signals scarcity, a price drop signals surplus. Consumers adjust, producers adjust. The entire economy adapts without any one person needing to understand the whole picture. This, for Hayek, is not just the magic of markets, it's the miracle of freedom. And this is where Hayek delivers one of his most central observations. Quote, "The more the state plans, the more difficult it becomes for individuals to plan." End quote. He warns that even the most benevolent planners must ultimately choose between allowing people to pursue their own ends or compelling them to serve ends chosen for them. And if the planner insists on the latter, he must not only prohibit dissent, he must destroy the very belief that people have a right to dissent. This is the road to serfdom, not a sudden turn, but a gradual decline. Not a conspiracy, but a consensus. Not a revolution, but a regression. From liberalism to collectivism, from freedom to conformity. Hayek does not leave us in despair. He believed that the road to serfdom could be reversed, but only if we remembered what freedom is for. Not the freedom to do what we like, but the freedom to take responsibility for ourselves. Freedom to fail and to learn. Freedom to speak uncomfortable truths. Freedom to live without being managed. In our own time, with rising distrust in capitalism, with growing demands for state solutions to everything from climate change to inequality, Hayek's message deserves to be remembered, not as an argument against caring for one another, caring for the planet, but as a reminder of how fragile freedom really is. When the solution to every problem is more planning, more control, more regulation, when every crisis justifies a new expansion of the state, we should ask ourselves, how far down this road are we willing to go?